Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University.
Welcome back to Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University lectures for MA English students on translation theory. My name is Sachin Ketkar and we will be talking about Roman Jakobson's theory of translation, and we started discussing it in our previous class. We have already seen how Roman Jakobson formulates his very seminal triadic theory of translation based on the ideas of semiotics as formulated by Ferdinand de Saussure and by Charles Sanders Peirce. So, he formulates this triadic theory of translation based on the idea that meaning is not the object. Secondly, meaning itself is a kind of explication and interpretation of one set of signs by other set of signs. So, meaning is not mental, meaning is not an objective thing, but a process of explication and interpretation of signs. So, for Jakobson, understanding is also a form of translation, and this understanding can be in three ways. You can understand a sign by a set of signs in the same language as in dictionary, and it is called intralingual translation. And it can also be between two languages. When you explain something in another language or understand something in another language, then it is interlingual translation. Or you can interpret and explain or communicate something in a very different system of signs, something which is called intersemiotic translation, which means verbal signs can be interpreted and explained, communicated using non-verbal signs, right. So, communication involving signs is not limited to single language. It can cross the boundaries of language, and it can also go into another semiotic system, like sign language that very often people who are challenged in terms of vocal cords, they are impaired, they use sign language, as we are aware. Now, this fact that communication can happen across languages and across sign systems is a profound statement, and let us try to understand why it is so profound. Because it goes against a widely held assumption called linguistic relativism, whose most famous proponent is Edward Sapir, and another very important anthropologist is a person called Benjamin Lee Whorf. And they both of them put forth a hypothesis which has become extremely influential in the study of language culture and culture. And what this hypothesis states is that the system and the structure of the language determines perception of the world, not the other way around. And what they are saying here is found in his own explanation given by Benjamin Lee Whorf, that is in front of you on the slide. And he is saying that language is not merely a reproducing instrument for voicing ideas, but rather is itself shaper of ideas, the program and a guide for individuals' mental activity, for his analysis of impressions, for his synthesis of his mental stock in trade. He is saying that we dissect nature along the lines laid down by our native languages. The categories and types that we isolate from the world of phenomena, we do not find there, because we stare because they stare every observer in the face. On the contrary, the world is presented in a kaleidoscopic flux of impressions, which is organized by our minds, which basically means that language is a cognitive system of perception which organizes our perception, which also means that the structure of signs and the structure of language, right, determines your cognition and perception. And they give a very famous examples that in some African languages like Hopi, there is no present perfect tense, which means there is inability to articulate things like my grandfather died. My grandfather had died when you came to my place. You cannot say such things because that grammatical structure is not available, which means they cannot even perceive the past in the same way as we do in our languages. So, our perception of past is dependent on the tense structure of grammar. The another example that they give is that languages like Eskimo languages have dozens of words for the shade of white and snow. So, our languages would have 2 or 3 kind of words. For example, in Gujarati, you will have baraf, right, and ice or something like that. But they have a whole range of 20 words, more than that, describing various stages and colors and shapes and hues of snow, right. So, their language has this inbuilt mechanism for perception of various shades of white, which our languages do not. As a result, we do not see or perceive those shades. Now, what is the problem with such kind of argument is that it does not allow for translation to happen, because in translation you need to cross the boundaries of language, which means, and he states there, that there is no communication possible between 2 languages. Why? Because both the languages have a different structure. So, translation is not possible. If by translation we mean cross cultural communication, it is not possible. So, what is not possible? What is not possible is that you cannot transfer meaning according to Sapir-Whorf thesis from, say for example, Gujarati language to Hindi or English and the other way around. So, transfer of meaning is not possible. So, translation is not possible. So, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis almost destroys the possibility of translation. So, Jakobson is arguing against such a hypothesis. He is saying that because explanation and communication across sign systems is possible, right, as we have seen interlingual interpretation and explication, intersemiotic explanations and interpretations and communication is possible, right, it is always possible to translate something, right, because you can explain something, say for example, name of a film through signs as a game is of dumb shards is played, right, or you can communicate something using pictures, or you can communicate something using photographs of something, right. So, communication in another sign system is possible, right. So, meaning is not something that is limited to a language. That is what he is believing. So, he goes on to argue that translation is always possible, right. Once we define translation as an act of semiotic explication and interpretation, it is always possible to communicate something in one language in another language. You may have to use loan translation. You may have to use loan words. You may have to use neologisms. You may have to rely on semantic shifts or circumlocutions, right? And he goes on to give examples from Russian to English. He talks about grammatical gender and grammatical number. For example, the moon is feminine in English, but the moon is masculine in Gujarati, right? So, gender of a noun is different, though we are talking of the same object. But does that stop us from understanding what moon is, right? So, a Gujarati speaking person will definitely understand what is meant by the moon. Just because its gender is different in another language does not become an obstacle for a person to communicate what is meant by moon. Verb, the article system. For example, Gujarati does not have article system. Hindi does not have an article system. You can always use something similar like determiners, right, to communicate the same experience. So, he goes on to argue here that in its cognitive function, language is minimally dependent on grammatical pattern. It is not completely dependent, and it stands to the definition of our experience in a metalinguistic way, which means by metalinguistic operations, which means we can talk about things, but we can also talk about the language itself, right. So, that is called metalingual operations, which stand in a complementary relation to any language, which makes articulations about language possible. And so, the assumption of ineffable or untranslatable cognitive data would be a contradiction in terms, right. So, there is no such thing like incommunicable message, right, because that is a paradoxical. If something can be communicated, it means it is a message. So, there is no such thing like incommunicable message, and that is a very important idea over here. So, the first thing that Jakobson's theory challenges is the very pedestrian ordinary belief in translation as or synonymy as an exact equivalence, right. And we saw that it is not even available in the same language. It does not exist. It is a myth, right. Secondly, he argues that you can communicate something which is coded in one language in some other language, right. So, you can communicate a message that is available in Gujarati in Tamil. You can always communicate the same thing in other language. But what is it that you cannot communicate? You cannot communicate, according to Jakobson, poetry, right, and literary translation for him is not that simply possible. Why? Because poetry relies substantially on the word, the materiality of the signifier itself is very important in a poem, which means wordplay, paranormasia as he calls it, all these are very important aspects of literature and poetry, especially poetry, right. Poetry is a kind of wordplay, right, and that wordplay cannot be communicated in other language, right. So, what he is saying that translation of poetry is by definition untranslatable, and this idea that non-literary communication is always possible, but poetic communication is always not possible is the cornerstone of formalist approach to literature. As we are aware, formalism, right, implies a distinction made between uh, the ordinary everyday language and the literary language. And some of us might be aware of Roman Jakobson's very famous essay called Linguistics and Poetics, where he argues that poetry is not a genre or text per se, but a function of language. That means it's a certain way of using language. And poetic way of using language is very different from all other usages of language. And he would go on to argue that in poetry, language is not used to refer to something, but it refers to itself, it's self-referential. And so, poetic use of language is very different from non-poetic use of language, and this binary is what makes Jakobson's theory vulnerable to critique from post-structuralist theorists. Right, but this is the cornerstone of formalist theory of language. And you will also notice that Russian formalist theory of language is very similar to ancient Sanskrit poetics, because ancient Sanskrit poetics were formalist in their orientation. Right, one of the earliest definitions of literature given by Bhamaha, right, talks about Shabdartho Sahito Kavyam, which means that word, the material aspect of word and the meaning converge. They come together in a literary communication. That means that the word is as important as the meaning, right? So, what does it mean when Bhama says this? He is saying that the aesthetic properties of the material of sound is as important as the conceptual aspect of language in literature, right? In all other discourses, meaning is more important than sound, right? So, artha is more important than shabda in most of other communication, but Bhamaha would say that it's also the shabda and artha both coming together. So, you can see that Sanskrit poetics is essentially formalist, and these formalist theories of literature create a kind of binary between Shabda and Artha, which lays it kind of vulnerable to post-structuralist critique of all binaries. But then Jakobson would say that even then you find translations of poetry all the time, right? Yeah, you will find world poetry available in translation for you. So, how is that possible? If it is by definition impossible, then what makes it possible, right? So, he says in such a situation, the very idea of translation has to be altered. He would say that translational act of literature, and this will be also relevant to the students of translation in their unit on literary translations, right? That in literary translation, there is creative transposition that has to happen, right? You change from one poetic shape into another. That's what he's saying, right? So, you cannot translate the word play, but you can create a similar kind of word play with a very different meaning in poem, right? And this is the formalist theory of literary translation, which we will also look at some length as we go along. But he ends his essay that we started discussing in our previous class on linguistic aspects of translation by looking at a very famous pun in Italian language. And in Italian language, this pun goes like this: tradutor, tradutor, right? Tradutor means translator, but tradutor also means betrayer. So, it is a pun, word play on the idea of translator as betrayer. So, this kind of negative associations that we find in Western culture, right, regarding translation makes it a secondary activity, a notion that we have to challenge all the time. You associate translation with the act of betrayal, right? So translation is something that that is bad, right? And it goes deep down into Western understanding of translation, going back to Plato, who saw that art is moving away from reality through mimesis. Now, when you translate art into another language, you are going further away from reality. So, art falsifies and translation falsifies even further. That's a Platonic perspective that is deeply ingrained in Western culture, which is responsible for this negativity associated with translation, right? So, traducer is this kind of, it expresses that negativity here. Another reason why there is this negativity associated with translation is because of the idea that we are looking for equivalence at the level of single word, right? Something called logocentric. Logos means word. Single word centric view of equivalence is something that has popularized the notion that translation is not possible, right? And it goes back to the Sumerian period where dictionaries were made of verbal equivalents. One word in Sumerian language, other word in Babylonian, third word in Akkadian, say for example. So, a word unit becomes the primary unit of equivalence, and that creates the idea that translation is not possible or it's an inferior act of creation. So, this is very important intervention by Roman Jakobson into the whole idea of what translation is, right. So, very often it happens that people ask this question, why should we bother about theory of translation, right? We are practicing, translation is basically a practice. Why should we bother about theories, right? The reason why we should bother about theories is because theory is trying to explain what translation is and the conditions of its happening. So, if we do not understand what translation is, then what will you practice, right? So, so if we understand translation in Jakobsonian terms as explication and interpretation, a semiotic explication and interpretation, which is not at the level of single word as its unit, then I am sure our translation quality goes up, right. So, we start looking at translation as a form of explication, as a form of understanding, as a form of recommunication, right, in which does not rely on the idea of single word equivalence, which is a myth, as we have discovered. So, this broader understanding of translation is required for a person to be a good translator. Otherwise, you will end up translating literally, which is not translating at all, which is just messing up the thing, right. So, one of the things that Jakobsonian theory does is that it intervenes and asks us to shift and alter our perception about what is translation and what happens in translation, which is very important for a practicing translator as well, right. One of the ways that we start translating in our life is by looking at word. What is the meaning of this word? Now, this itself shows how wrong it is. You are not asking questions about what is meaning of the word. You should be asking question about what is the meaning of this sentence. What does this sentence do, right? Or what does this paragraph do? What does this phrase do? What does this idiom do, right? Rather than asking what is the meaning of this word, right? So dictionaries, if you have to use too many dictionary for too many times, then you are not translating well, because you are still fixated on the idea of translation as a form of equivalence between words. So this is a very important development in translation studies, which opened up possibilities of understanding translation in much broader sense. And what is also very interesting and important for us is that Jakobson is providing a critique of the idea that translation is not possible, right? And there is a very famous scholar in Marathi called Rabha Patankar, and Rabha Patankar says that translation is impossible in theory but always possible in practice. Now, if something is impossible in theory and possible in practice, it means it's a wrong theory. Your theory does not describe adequately or explain what is happening in practice. So only when you have a bad theory, you can come up with bad translation, right? So this is a very important point that I wanted to elaborate regarding relation between translation theory and practice, and the place of theories like Jakobson's in understanding what translation is and what happens in translation, right? It's an explanation, because theory is primarily an explanation of what something is and how it works. So according to Jakobson, translation is a form of semiotic explication and interpretation, right, which can happen across semiotic systems and languages, and also within semiotic system and language, right? So that is a very broad perspective on translation that is much needed for us as students of translation in India. And one of the reasons why I highlight this all the time is because in India we live with 4 languages at a time. Yeah, you can stop here for a while. ના હજુ એક લેક્ચર બાકી છે. હા ચાલશે, 1 મિનિટ. Any summary? Yeah. So in this second class on Jakobson's theory of translation, we discussed how the Jakobsonian frame for understanding translation helps us to overcome linguistic relativism. The idea that communication in one language is not possible in some other language, which is the cornerstone of something called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, is something that can be overcome using Jakobsonian framework of looking at language and translation. So this is a great advantage of Jakobson's framework. And we also saw why there is this negativity associated with translation and what's the relation between theory and practice of translation. So in the next and the last class, we'll look at some of the critiques of Jakobson's theory. And we'll also see how people try to develop Jakobson's theory further, right? We'll look at some of the most important statements in that. So this is where I want to stop for this second class, and we'll discuss the remaining portion of Jakobson's theory in our next class. Thank you.